Privet, Katila, Wan Ningrizki desu. And in this video, I wanted to follow up with a video I made about a week ago talking about the what I predict was going to be the Russian axis of attack for the summer, which is basically to get behind the Seversk, make it into a bubble, and also take Chasov Yar, and then also some attacks towards Livan. So I kind of talked about how what the Russians will be focusing on, what we should be looking out for. Now I want to do the opposite video with what the Ukrainians will be focusing on for the next for the offensive. I'm going to talk about uh, what we should expect, what their goals are, what we should expect from them, my thoughts on how they will be successful or not, and we'll just see if it all just kind of give my own opinion on it, just my predictions. Um, so the first thing we need to look at, as always, is the strategic aspect. What are the Ukrainians trying to focus on? Well, as we've known, and this has been telegraphed repeatedly, is that the upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to be focused on retaking the land bridge. Why is that important? Well, basically, I cannot stress enough on how important the land bridge is to Russia's operations in Ukraine. If the Ukrainians manage to do their main strategic objective, which is to get all the way to the Sea of Azov and return back to the Crimea border here, this is game, set, match. Basically, it is over for the Russians. That is how big this, how important this is. And the reason why it's super important is because, this is what, once they're here, what the Ukrainians will do, they will launch attacks, destroy the Crimea bridge, and basically turn this into an isolated hub where they could try to starve it out. Now, the Russians will be able to supply it, but, they'll be able to start striking Crimea proper, which at the moment the land bridge prevents. So this basically, with this gone, it complicates matters with Crimea, basically, and basically, it's just this is one of the best areas for Russia to hold on to, try to expand outwards. But with this gone, it's going to be a very hard time for Russia to recover from the loss of the land bridge. This is probably one of the best things they've done, except probably in terms of geopolitical outcomes, not geopolitical, I guess outcomes in this war. They took Mariupol, but that's kind of part of the land bridge. But in terms of what they have so far, nothing much. Like they took North Luhansk, they advanced, took Bakhmut, basically. I mean, this taking some cities and towns isn't really big important. In terms of securing a land connection to Crimea, that is very important. And so taking that will do a massive blow to Russia's what Russia has done so far in Ukraine. This is very important from a strategic perspective. Now, what is the now that we know what Ukraine, now why this, as I meant, and why am I so certain they'll attack here? Not only have they choreographed said that they'll attack here, but you might think, well, maybe they're faking it. Like, for example, he talked about wanting to attack in Kherson, but then attacked in Kharkov as well. Well, I mean, they attacked in Kherson anyway, so we know that just because they say it doesn't mean they won't do it. They said they were going to Kherson, and then they did attack in Kherson. But they didn't mention Kharkov, and that's something that's kind of interesting. I think that they might try to redo that playbook again, and I'll explain how in the summer. But first, let's talk about what the Ukrainians will try to do. So what do I mean about them trying to repeat what happened in the fall? Now, the thing is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is based upon the one thing Ukraine has as a kind of check mark over the Russians, which is their manpower. Now, with mobilization in September, Russia has made it more easier for them. But if you take total troops in Ukraine from the Russian side and total Ukraine troops that Ukraine has, it's about Ukraine still outnumbers the Russians, but not as much. But that, because as we've seen, Ukraine has done 9 mobilization waves. Russia has only done 1. On day 1 of the invasion, Ukraine has been in a mass general mobilization. Not like, oh, let me call up the reserves. I mean, general mobilization means even if you've never been in the army, we are drafting your ass and you're going to the front line. And so Ukraine has been in this total state of drafting everyone and their mothers, their dogs, and even the dead ones, that resurrecting them from the ground to bring them to the front line. Now, the thing is that um, that is the thing that they've used to, and that is how, for example, they defeated the Russians in Kharkov. When you look at the Kharkov counteroffensive, there was no Russians here. There was a battle in Balaklia, and then basically they gave up this entire land without a fight. They started battling when they started, battled a little bit in Kupix and Liman for a few weeks, but then those were eventually given up before the mobilization wave allowed them to stabilize the front along the Kremenaya-Swatovo line. But what happened was the Ukrainians gathered 30,000 men and fought against about 1,000 Russians that were defending Balaklia, and then there was basically maybe 1,000 or in Izium, but they left before they even fought, and so basically they outnumbered the Russians 6-7 to 1 in this area, and they took them out. Same thing in Kherson, except they only outnumbered them about 2 or 3 to 1 in Kherson. So this is how the Ukrainians will attack. They'll be focusing on their main, using their strengths, which is their numerical superiority. When I mentioned about the Russian offensive last video, it's based on the Russian strength, which is firepower. What we're going to see in the Russian one, I didn't mention in that video, but it's going to be small attacks on these villages. It's going to be Battle of Shithole Village number 2. I mean, I'm not saying these are shitholes. These are probably lovely Donbass villages, but I'm just saying, these little Donbass villages will be fought over for a week at a time as Russia slowly just grinds its way through artillery until until it reaches its strategic goal. So take a week to take this, a week to take this, a week to take this, and just slowly over the summer try to do what I said. The Ukrainians don't have that. One, because they don't have firepower superiority. They cannot just grind the Russians out. As we've seen, for example, in shell usage, for every 10 shells the Russians shoot, the Ukrainians shoot like 1 or 2. It is disproportionate. The only way they could win is by using their numerical superiority to overrun the Russian lines. Now, I'm going to talk about why, while they were successful in Kharkov and Kherson, I don't think they'll be as successful here for a multitude of reasons. But let's first talk about what they're going to do. Let's get to, now, I'm going to use another map here, which is, this allows you to kind of draw things and kind of put things in perspective. This is a Ukrainian map, or made by pro-Ukrainian people. I know this because the way they make their map is based on the reports of the Ukrainian General Staff, and that is it. Basically, so this is how the Ukrainian General Staff kind of sees the battlefield. But it does allow you to draw lines instead of me just using my fingers, so you guys could kind of come along with it and such. Now, before we begin on what the Ukrainians will do, we need to look at another map, which is Russian fortifications in Zaparozhia. So now that we know that they're going to attack here, where are they going to attack? How are they going to attack? Now, the goal, obviously, is to overrun these positions and try to make a break for it to the Sea of Azov. To do that, they need to find a weak point in the line and exploit it. Here's my prediction, okay? They're not going to attack on a broad front. The Russians have more men here and have more fortifications and have more troop density than at any other point that the Ukrainians have attacked since. Now, but still, the way they're not going to attack on a broad front, just as they're still going to, well, let me put it this way. They're not going to attack just in one area, but the main thrust is going to come from one direction. And from this open source map, which is all I have, I don't have a magic ball. I don't get secret classified information from the Ukrainians or the Russians or whatever. But from what I see, is that we have to see where the fortifications are the weakest, and it's right here. They have some fortifications on the front line here, but if the Ukrainians manage to penetrate this, there's nothing here. There's no fortifications here. They have fortifications on this crossroads here, but if they could break through here, right? I mean, there's nothing here. But if you look here, there's multitude. There's some fortifications on the front line, a big second line, a third one, multitude fourth ones. There's a lot of lines of defense. Attacking here will be suicide. Now, there's going to be attacks here anyway. But they're not going to try to like break through here. They're there to pin down the Russians, hold them down as they try to do an encirclement here, try to make them force them to leave, just as they did, for example, in Kharkov. There was no Battle of Izium. When they won at Balakleia by pushing through here and going towards here, they forced the Russians to leave, and that is what they're going to try to do in Zaparozhia. And if we look here with these fortifications, it will be somewhere here is my guess. Now, so if let's go to the map where we could use, try to get a kind of perspective on what we should expect. So now there's a lot of open fields here, but so let's see, where's this? As we get there, so there's trying to like kind of compare the two here. So Fedorovka near that. Alrighty. Fedorovka. Let's see here. Let's see. I am sorry. I do not. Well, let's first of all talk about Let me just go back here for a second. So they'll attack here. This will be the line here, and oh, hold up. I think I'll know where that is. Yeah, here we go. Okay, there we go. So something here. So this line here from about like the Russians from here to this edge of Polony. If we see the Russian fortifications here, well, not because there's a defense line here, but about they're going to try to. This is where the Russians have their defenses, but if they could penetrate this area right here, so there's like some Russian fortifications around this part right here. But if they can manage to break through this area here, this entire open area will be open to them. What they'll do next is if they could break through this first defense line, the main thrust will be they'll be setting up formations in Gallipoli, and then they'll advance to this direction towards Bilmak and try to basically form a salient here. So if I could make like a kind of just, I'm not talking about like what they'll try to do, but just kind of like hold up. This is how the. Sorry, I'm trying to. Okay, there we go. Now, sorry for I don't use this map a lot, but anyway, they're gonna try to do a thrust here. And what happens here? Well, then they could start attacking. Go downer and downer until they make a hook, and then they could just bypass. Because then their goal is if they could reach, say here. Let's say they attack this area. There's no Russian, as we can see in the Russian fortifications, there's no Russian fortifications in this area. If they could reach, this line here, for example, they'll try, let's say they go here, try to, kind of go over here. The Russians will be in a very bad position in this area. And then the goal is to not force their way through the most defensible positions here, but try to do a hook. There's one downside to this, though. First, if they do manage to break through, which is a thing on itself, what they'll try, it's how do I say this? If they have to do this, the success or failure of this counteroffensive from the Ukraine will be decided within the first 2 weeks of the operation starting. If the Ukrainians do not make some sort of big push and don't manage to reach Bilmak, if they attack where I think they're going to attack based on open sources, then they'll be, if they only say they advance, they take maybe the first village, a couple of these villages that are kind of in the grain zone, but they don't actually make a deep enough spearhead that within the first 2 weeks, then it's basically over, because then they lose the initiative. They've lost, they didn't. Their troops, the troops they amassed with the Western equipment did not break the Russian line. They need to break the Russian line, do a hook, and collapse the front. They're going to try to force the Russians to fall back to Crimea so that they could sweep this entire area without a fight. Now, um, that's basically now again the this is based on open sources, based on the Russian fortifications. As we can see, they'll probably attack from here to the to the west, no, to the east, sorry, of Polony, and try to break through this line here and try to basically get to Berdansk, to the direction of Berdansk. If they could reach Bilmak, then they could just basically go through this open country that is undefended, and then just force the Russians to give up this entire this huge amount of defense works here. I could see the Russians holding at Melitopol because they have a good defense line here, and they still have this area. But then basically they cut this. This allows them to reach Berdansk and basically cut the land bridge anyway, so they could get their operational goal, which is stopping Russian logistics from going to Crimea anyway. And if they reach Berdansk and only take this part of the land bridge, but somehow the Russians stop them from taking this part, for example, they could still bomb the Crimean bridge and get what they want anyway. It just would be a bit, to the Ukrainians, would be sweeter if they could just liberate or take back all of Kherson and Zaparozhia. But for purposes of to do their strategic and operation, to get their operational goals, all they need is really just to have a breakthrough here and reach here. The only downside is then there'll be basically a giant salient here with Russians here, and then Russians here, and basically they could. I mean, what stops the Russians from attacking up here and up here again? And then collapse. Having the Ukrainians that are in this pocket just collapse again. This is why, it's actually, they need to collapse the front, not make it, not just do a salient, because if they keep that salient for long, then the Russians will destroy them. So I cannot stress enough how important it is for the Ukrainians in this counteroffensive. So they'll be trying to do a shock fist. There'll be attacks across the entire front, but the major where they'll try to outnumber the Russians in a particular point to make a hook and collapse the front. That is what they'll try to do. Now, break through these fortifications here and try to basically reach, try to collapse the front immediately. Now, so if we look here, if there'll be attacks on, from to pin down the Russians, and maybe even try to break through, because they'll probably just to maybe test Russian just have a hope of breaking through somewhere. But I think they'll try to go, and plus with ubiquitous or widespread Western ISR, I think the Americans have told them basically where the most weakest point of this defense line is, and that is where the Ukrainians will attack. I don't know exactly where that is, but just based on open sources, I just think it's going to be somewhere here, where there's barely any defense. And, somewhere here, because everyone's been focusing on, this area, because this is the main Zaparozhia line. But, one thing that will be kind of interesting is that if we see here, there's no according to, this map here, which shows Russian forces on the border of Velika Novosolika, also with this Ukrainian map, is that there's no fortifications up in this area. So the Russians allegedly control up to here, but only fortifications here. So I expect that a counterattack, they'll probably see this area collapse, because it's a big, again, as I mentioned, there's a salient. It's not a straight line. This is why this has been a static front line for a year now, because it's a very good place to have a natural defense. This is a bit more higher, and it has a little bit of a bulge, and that's why the Russians want to maybe make it more straight, and that's why I only built defense lines here. So we could see this collapse a little bit. The downside of this, though, is that if they retreat here, then this kind of could put their Ugledar operation in jeopardy. It might, because then the flanks will be exposed. Now, one thing, as I mentioned before, they'll try to replicate the main thrust, like what they tried to do last fall. And now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think actually, so while I think Zaparozhia is going to be the main thrust of the attack, as I mentioned before, as we saw You know, and I think it's, as I mentioned again, it's going to be attacks along the it's going to be a broad frontline attack, but with a major, with a pinprick, with a thrust operation to try to force the Russians to give in, with the goal of taking the land bridge. While this is the main thrust of attack, I do think that there's going to actually be where they're going to strike first is going to be in Kherson. You might be wondering, what? Why? This is to distract the Russians. If they could pull Russian forces from Zaporozhia to Kherson, I think this will be, you know, then the more the merrier, so they could actually achieve a breakthrough because they want as less Russian forces as possible here. So I think, and you know, they have some strategic objectives that they would like to achieve in Kherson. Now, there's going to be they have a bunch of new Marine brigades that they've developed. We're going to see crossings across the Dnieper. I do not think they'll be able to hold, you know, they might try to take a lot of the islands, but I do not think, because of logistics problems, they'll be able to hold it or, you know, actually develop a bridgehead and advance out. I don't think so. They might, but who knows? But I think most important is just to pin down the Russians, or at least distract the Russians. And I think we'll see an attack here for the first 2 weeks. Who knows? But I do. It's not going to just be a Zappa attack. They're going to attack on more than just this front to distract the Russians. And I think they're going to attack somewhere first, just to loosen them up. Now, but there is some strategic thing. So let's say they don't manage to break through in Zaporozhia. They do want to take some things here. One thing they want to take is to take this Kibrin Sprit, as it's called. If they could take this area here, this would unblock the Nikolaev port and basically secure a bridgehead on the opposite side of the Dnieper and allow them to continue harassing Russian lines here. They want to take this thing back so they could unblock the Nikolaev port. Another thing they're going to do 100% because they've done it before is to do assaults across the Dnieper here and try to take Energodar, to take the Zaporozhia nuclear power plant back. And ideally, what they would like to do is break through enough where they could make like a land connection here, because again, it's very hard to supply a bridgehead like this. So that's what they'll try to do. So there's like some objectives here, but I think there'll be an attack here in Kherson to distract from the main thrust, which will be in Zaporozhia. Now, another thing I want to mention here is that Ukrainians don't have to take the whole. One thing that they might want to do is that if their thrust thing doesn't work, if they don't manage to break through the entire, do a shock thrust that collapses the front with their overwhelming numerical advantage, then they might want to not take the entire land bridge, but take only a modest amount. And so instead of taking their strategic objectives, there could be something where you could call it a success, but not a full success. What will count as a Ukrainian success in this area? This is my own personal opinion, but if the Ukrainians manage to establish a new front line, say from Energodar, I'm just gonna, this is not an exact science, but let's say they manage to take Tokmak and go to Bilmak here, as we saw, and if they can reach Volonovka here. So as you can see, this long line here. If they could push the Russians back to this line, then that could count as a victory. If the Russians could prevent them from taking Tokmak, this is the key town here. This will be a major place of fighting. If the Russians could prevent them from taking this, then the Ukrainians basically failed. I think it's almost certain the Ukrainians will take a few villages for certain, but how much more can they push the Russians back is up for the debate. They're going to try to do a shock offensive, as I mentioned, but if they can't succeed that way, then their measure of success so first they'll try to force the Russians through a breakthrough to push them back to Crimea. If that doesn't work, try to do local try to basically force their way towards this line. Why is this line important? Because then they could try again in a few months, and at that point, because they got closer, they could actually strike all Russian logistics here. Right now, actually, with the current front line, Russians could actually move supplies from Mariupol, Berdansk, and almost up to Melitopol without being harassed. So they could do movement of logistics freely, and Melitopol could only be struck with HIMARS. So right now, but if they reach Tokmak, they'll be able to use a lot more systems to destroy Russian logistics and make it easier for them to go on the offensive once more in a later future. So they could. It's just basically, so if they reach this line, it's a success, but not as much success as they would like. So in terms of, do I think they'll succeed? I don't think so, because if you look at, again, what happened is the front lines have been reduced by hundreds of miles. The Russian forces on the ground have doubled, and the Ukrainians are, and because of those two factors, and if we look at what happened in Kherson, where the Russians were outnumbered and had worse logistics problems, they managed to hold out. They actually, Ukrainians didn't advance at all. They took a few villages, but they never actually managed to push the Russians back, like forced them to go back. The Russians retreated out of their own volition. Unlike Kharkov, which was a rout, the Kherson was Russia just giving up on Kherson. Now that was because the Ukrainians destroyed their logistics, but and that was the Russians decided to leave. But right now, they can't do a repeat of it. There's no bridge here that will deny logistics here. The Russians, if the Russians hold, they could keep getting supplied. And so, considering they were in a worse situation in Kherson and managed to hold them off and only retreated because of logistics issues, and considering they have more men now, more defenses, and they don't have that logistics problem that the Ukrainians could exploit, I think the Ukrainians are going to have a hard time succeeding. But they need to do this as a Hail Mary. Just because if they, as I mentioned, if they take the land bridge, it's basically over. The Russians, it'll be Battle Crimea will start once this falls, and that will be a bad time for the Russians. Now, yeah, so that's basically my take on what's going to happen. I hope you guys enjoyed. I know this was a bit of a long-winded, kind of bigger picture. One thing I'll say before I leave is that we might see an attack in North Luhansk as a distraction. Because they've been talking about an attack on Zappa, but I don't rule out that the Ukrainians will try to attack somewhere completely random outside of Zappa. Because while Kherson was what they wanted, because they wanted to deny Russia a bridgehead on the other side of the Dnieper, which was their main strategic point, they did another attack that wasn't telegraphed at all. And so they're telegraphing this attack because this is their main attack, but there's probably going to be another attack. Now, I said it was going to be Kherson. Maybe that's my most likely guess, but again, we might see a broad frontline attack, except here, because attacking here is suicide. Basically, it's the reason why Russians have advanced at a snail's pace here, because of all the Donbass fortifications. So we might see an attack here, just as a distraction. But yeah, so that's it for today. So aim high, wander on, from America with Russian love.